Hello, Faith.
Hello.
Hi. Nice to meet you again. We've been in contact for a few months on social media, and then we met in person at the Battle of Ideas.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. And the reason I wanted to speak to you is because you've done a lot of interesting work regarding the prison system. Well, not just prison system, but prisons in general. And we'll get to that in a minute. But first of all, for those people who don't know who you are, can you just explain who you are and your journey leading up to this point?
Well, I've been working within the sort of prison system for well over 10 years. I first started as monitoring my local prison, and I worked my way up to being the chairman of the board there. Um, I've been involved with lots of organisations. I'm an ambassador for the Corbett Network, and the Corbett Network is it must be about 100 organisations now that all work towards prison reform. And so I've taken on that role this year. Um, I've been writing about prisons for many years, for about 12 years now. And I write a blog, and I've done about 125 blogs over 12 years. And they've been read and shared now in 106 countries. So I'm really delighted with that. So I cover all sorts of subjects, but it's mainly around prisons and prison reform.
Okay. So you explained a little bit about your journey there, but when we spoke about of ideas, you were saying that basically initially when you started talking about prisons and what happened in them, you met with some resistance. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I went to my first, as I call it, my first proper job. I was 19 and I worked for NACRO, and I was just in the office, but I met a lot of the men that we were organising placements for when they came out of prison, sort of 6 months placements. A lot of them were like gardening teams, painting teams, manual work it was. And I met some fascinating people. And they used to bring me newspaper cuttings about the crimes that they'd committed, and one was a safe blower, uh, and I think then a seed was planted, and then I went and did other sort of work because I was only working for NACRO for about a year, and then I decided that when I was in my 40s to go to university, and I studied criminology. So as a mature student, I came up with a lot of opposition to what I wanted to speak about, write about, um, because people were saying, "Well, no one's interested in prisons," and so I did one on women in prison, and the feedback I got was, "Well, who's interested in women? And women in prisons? No." Restorative justice. I did my dissertation on restorative justice, and I remember lecturers saying, "Well, what's that?" And it was like every step of the way, every time I wanted to do something, I think, "Oh, well, what does she want?" And it's the same when I started monitoring the prisons. Um, some of the things that I saw, I heard, people just didn't seem to care. I mean, the conditions of prisons, I mean, I've visited every category. I've seen some of the worst prisons and probably some of the best prisons, if you can have a best prison. The conditions that people are having to live in. And when sometimes I do talks, and I say, it's important to reintegrate people back into the society. And they're, "Oh yeah, 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 no, that's really good. Yeah, yeah, give them a second chance. Yeah, 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 yeah." But when you say, "What about if they moved into your neighborhood?" "Oh no, no, not in my neighborhood. Not in my neighborhood." And that's what you come across all the time. There doesn't seem to be any change in that.
Is that regardless of what type of crime they've done? So say if someone's, I don't know, stolen a chocolate bar from uh, um, a news agents if they were 15 to someone who's done some more serious crimes, it seems to be indiscriminate in terms of how we view prisoners.
Well, it's a stigma, isn't it? It's the stigma having a criminal record, and that seemed to stay with you. Um, I mean, even if you had just done that, you try and get insurance for your car, insurance for your house. It's like there's punishment when you're in prison because of the conditions you have to live in, and you're punished by the courts. Then on release, you're still punished. You've served your sentence, but yet the punishment continues. There doesn't seem to be anyone who can accept that, the slate's clean. Oh no, you're an ex-prisoner, or an ex-convict, or you're ex-con, or whatever. It's always like we'll refer back to that in some way.
Yeah, it's certainly a stigma for sure. I
Yeah.
mean, how effective do you think actually prisons are? Do you think they're effective in all in terms of not just keeping people in prison and stop them doing crime, but when they come out, is that effective in that regard? Do people learn a lesson if they go to prison?
Well, majority of prisons are warehouses. That's my opinion, and I've written about that quite a lot, because they just store people.
Mm.
And often people are worse when they come out than when they went in. Um, mental health wise, you can say it like that. But also, people lose so much when they go into prison. Their job, their home, often their marriage breakdown, depending on what the crime was, and depending on how close they were to their families. But I don't think that prisons do enough to actually prepare for release. I remember talking to someone who was in prison for not many months, and he said to me that he felt that you should start on day one to prepare you for release, not wait, so many months before you're about to, your date that you're given, or maybe a year before get to an open prison or whatever. It should be just preparation should start straight away. You know, oh, you're just warehousing people. You're putting them in a cell for sometimes 22, 23 hours a day. You're not really doing much with them. They can't get to education because there's not enough staff. There's not enough purposeful activity, or there's not enough to stimulate them. And I think that's totally wrong. You know, when you look at the cost for someone in prison, I mean, it varies depending on what category of prison they're in. But what are you doing with that money? Why does it cost so much when you're doing so little with them? That's very frustrating for me, very frustrating. Because boredom sets in very quickly. Mental health issues. If you didn't have a mental health issue before you went into prison, it's likely that you'll have one when you come out. That's not the way to treat people. That's in my opinion, anyway. But others will say, well, they did the crime, got to do the time, and that's it. Or lock them up and throw away the key. That's not me. I don't believe that's right. You should do something with people while they're in prison, and not enough is being done. I mean, you just have to read some of the reports on various prisons, and it's the same year after year. Lack of purposeful activity, boredom, locked up for most of the day. It doesn't seem right.
Let's expand that a minute in regards to education. Just for those who are watching now, this will be 2 weeks after I've done another interview with someone who teaches philosophy in prison.
Right,
Uh,
yeah.
Obviously, it's part of a book he wrote, and he talks about the educational aspect of prison and whatnot. And what he does is a good thing, but I was just wondering how much of an emphasis is put on education in prisons. I know there are possibly classes there, but are prisons actually pushed to do that, or was the situation regarding that?
Well, there's been a lot of people who involved in prison education that have written books, and I've read a few of them. And it's all, if you can't get the person to education, well, then it's a waste, isn't it? Waste of resources. I mean, there's some really good educators within a prison, um, but if you can't get the people to education, or you can't get some form of education while they're in their cell, well, it's ridiculous. The prison that I monitored for almost 4 years, they had an excellent education program, but a lot of it was based on manual work. You know, you've got plastering, painting, bricklaying, cleaning floors. I didn't know there were so many different types of floor that you could clean, but you know, all these kind of things. Well, a lot of them, you know, enjoyed and knew that they would be able to get a job on release. But not everyone is like that. You know, what about using up here a little bit? You know, so encouraging people to study, giving them the opportunities to study, to go beyond level 1 or 2 in education, which is sort of like basic English, basic maths. Why can't they have just a bit more? I mean, philosophy is great because it gets you thinking about all sorts. It takes you out of almost like it takes you out of the cell that you're in and gives you, I don't know, a bigger outlook on life. Subjects like that are great. They're great. But if the emphasis isn't on education, on preparing them for the next stage in their life, well, then education departments are just going to fizzle out.
Yeah, indeed. I'm just wondering, I remember a few years ago seeing a documentary on the Strangeway riots. I think it was in the late 80s those took place in Manchester. Was it Strangeways, I think? Um, and obviously, for those who know Strange riots, I think that's what it's called anyway. It was like a prison in Manchester. There was, well, more of a protest than a riot. That'd be a more accurate way of putting it, because of conditions of the prisons, because a lot of them hadn't really been developed since Victorian times, I
Yeah.
believe. So,
Mm.
has it from because of that protest? Did anything develop from that? I.e., was there a purpose to say, okay, or at least make the conditions a little bit better, or was nothing really done in the end?
Well, one of the things that they complained about, because yes, they climbed onto the roof and they did an incredible amount of damage to the actual structure of the prisons, fires and whatever. But one of the issues was slopping out, and that's where you don't have a in-cell sanitation at all. You've got a bucket, so at night or whatever, you know, you have to use a bucket. It still happens. It's still happening in some prisons. So what happened to that? You know, the um, Lord Timpson, he said last week in the Justice Select Committee that the backlog for maintenance in prisons, it was at £1 billion in 2021. It's now double that. Can you imagine that? And I think it was, I think he said 23,000 cells will not still have to go through like fire safety. I mean, when you think back to the Manchester riots, yes, some things did change. But we've still got a heck of a lot of problems, heck of a lot, because it's not in the investment. I mean, it's like a black hole, isn't it? You know, the government says, well, we're going to give so much to, you know, justice and whatever, but it all disappears down this black hole, and you don't really see much for it. I want to know where all the money's gone, and how on earth are they going to raise the money, 2 billion in maintenance backlog? How are they going to do that? Well, they're not, are they? People are going to still be in terrible conditions. I mean, I visited Berwyn when it only been open about a year in Wales, and that at the time that was the largest prison in Europe. Purpose built. I had all these ideas and whatever for it, and I went into some of the cells. They were absolutely tiny. They had a shower and they had a toilet in the cells, but it was like tiny bit of material with a magnet there and something there, and you just did it across. And if you was sharing a cell with someone, well, there was no privacy, no privacy at all. You know, that was a new prison that cost millions. So they're not learning the lessons, are they? I mean, there's a new prison supposed to open, I think, next year. Mill Site, I think that's what it's called. But you wonder what it's actually going to be like. I hope it is better than what Berwyn was when that was first opened. That had terrible problems. And I
Mm.
visited it in the summer, and it was absolutely baking. The whole place, it was terrible. I don't know how people could work there, let alone have to live there.
Yeah, it's that prison in Wales. When did that open?
Oh gosh, about 6 years ago, maybe. I'm trying to think.
Okay,
Yeah.
so fairly recent. Um, yeah, you wonder why that would be the case then if it sort of got slapping out. Because just from a hygiene perspective,
Well, it's slopping out. Slopping out is in some of the older prisons, and they haven't dealt with that issue in all the prisons, and I think that's terrible. You know, I can't imagine it, can you? Just inhumane, in my opinion. But then other people think, well, punishment, don't care about them. But majority of people will be leaving prison and they'll all be back in society. So
mm,
why would you treat people so badly while they're in prison? And then the people that sent them to prison is then, they're having to deal with all these different issues when they're in prison. And then on the outside, if you haven't had help while you're on the inside, how are you going to cope on the outside?
mm,
There are some good organisations that will um, help from when they're still in prison and help through the gate, which I think is fantastic. But there's not a lot of money available for them. I mean, there should be more money available for organisations to do that, but a lot of it they're charities, and they rely on people for support. Um, I mean, I've seen some really really good examples, but on the whole, there's not enough. Not enough. Because as
mm.
we know that people are leave prison and they're homeless. Or some, I remember one women's prison, they were given tents on release. So the system's not joined up, is it really? It's not at all.
No, it doesn't seem that way. And you raised an interesting point about homeless. I was just wondering, what percentage of prisoners were homeless before going into prison? And I wonder what percentage were from the military? Because I imagine with those two is pretty high.
Well, with the military, there are some organisations that will help. I'm trying to think of their names right now. Off the top of my head, I can't think of them. But it's not just whether they're veterans or young men or women. If you haven't got um, accommodation available, there's not enough approved premises, but approved premises, aren't they? But
Mm,
what I've heard when people have talked to me about them, they're just like prisons. The drugs are rife. There's not really the support for them. um, they're run by private contractors often. There needs to be something, there's a gap there, because if you're released homeless, what do you do? Where are you going to get any food from? How are you going to live? And you're more likely to, commit another crime in order to have a roof over your head. But why should people commit crime just to have somewhere to live? But it happens.
mhm.
It happens too much.
You said about the budget there, it was 1 billion to about 4 years ago, and since then it's doubled to 2
Two
billion.
billion. That's what Lord Timpson said
What,
um, last week.
what reasons did you give?
Sorry,
What reasons did you give for that doubling in 4 years?
he didn't. He didn't give up. Um, but if you think that that you've got the old Victorian prisons, and they're going to be, if you don't maintain them, if you don't maintain anything, they're just going to start to crumble. You
Mm,
know, I think it's terrible. I don't know how they were actually going to do that, and some of the prisons I think do need to be knocked down. But the problem is they're not getting rid of the old Victorian prisons. They're still building new ones because it's not going to be less prison places. They're building more.
Yeah.
So if you've got all these places, you're going to want to fill them, aren't you?
Mm-hmm.
So the prison population is not going to decrease because you're just going to build more and more, and then you're going to fill them.
Is it not going to decrease now? I know this Labour government, when it first came in, prisoners were released because of the full capacity. Basically, you're getting, is it 2 and 3 in a cell now in some prison?
Well, due to the overcrowding, because in the Justice Select Committee they said that there was like 100 places left, and so they had to do something. So instead of being released at the 50% mark of your sentence, and then you serve the rest in the community, they're releasing them at 40% of their sentence to try and add a bit of capacity. But they're talking about 100,000 population coming to about 100,000. I mean, I looked it up on Monday this week. It was 86,038 people in prison. That's an awful lot.
Mm-hmm.
Awful lot. And yes, cells that were designed for one person have 2 in, and some that were designed have 3 in. I mean, I haven't personally seen that, but I've seen the cells that have got 2 in, and that you wonder how on earth 2 people can cope being in such a tiny space for such a long period of time. No.
So spaces in prisons are becoming less and less. Like you're saying, there's like 100 now. Then why hasn't any government done anything really meaningful regarding people with IPPs down in prison?
Well, that's a big problem, and I don't understand why they won't go for resentencing. I mean, for those that are out in the out of prison, it's been reduced, that their license period has been reduced for a lot of people, but there's still loads left in prison. And we read about the stories nearly every week. There's some terrible stories about people that stolen a mobile phone, and at a young age, and they're still there because they have to prove that they're not a risk to society. Now, how do they do that? Some of them are supposed to do these particular courses, but they're sent to prisons that don't offer those courses. So what are they meant to do?
Mm.
They try and get transferred, but there's no guarantee that what they're supposed to be doing is available there. So it's year after year after year, and it's like they're just stuck in the system, and no one really wants to deal with it, and this government doesn't want to deal with it.
Yeah,
I just
yeah,
don't understand. I just don't.
yeah.
Because
It's a,
they say that, because of risk, and that they're a danger to society, and there might be a small percentage that are, and they need to stay in prison. But it doesn't mean to say that the whole cohort, all of them, the IPPs, need to stay in prison. Prison is in place for some of them. Some of them have got such mental health issues. It's heartbreaking to read about it. And
mm,
prison isn't the place for them.
yeah. We've had someone who's a partner, a prisoner who's under IPP at the moment, and she was telling difficulties our partners having. Um, how many people in prison are under IPP currently?
Oh, I don't know it offhand. Is it close to 2,000? I'm not sure. I don't have the figure to hand. Um, but more than there should be.
Yeah, I mean, let's say for argument's sake, a quarter. Say for the sake of argument, it's 2,000. and a
Yeah.
quarter of them are the sentences are that serious that they have to stay in prison. You still got 1,500 where you could release. It's simple. I mean, I hear some tales of people who start a bike when they're 15 and in prison when they're 34, and you think that's
How?
just crazy.
Yeah, you think, how has that happened? You know, because they have to prove to the parole board that they're not a risk. How do you do that?
Mhm.
You know, and the longer they stay in prison, the harder it is for them to prove anything because they're not going to be in any fit state, you know, and then releasing them at, say, after, 12, 15 years over their sentence. And you think, how can they live? How can they reintegrate? But it's not just those that are in prison, but the families that and friends that have tried to support them over the years. It must be so frustrating for them. Well, as I said, it's heartbreaking. It really is. I mean, I've over the last year, I've written quite a bit about the IPPs on blogs, and I wasn't actually going to get involved in that because I didn't feel that I knew enough about the subject. But then I had members of family members contact me and say, Faith, is there any way that you can help? So what I've tried to do is to get the facts out, get the stories of different IPPs, get it out to a wider audience,
Mhm.
make people more aware of what's really going on. And it has been a lot more in the media over the last year, which is great, but we need some action.
Mhm.
Really need some action.
Yeah.
And it's disappointing to hear time and time again from the government they're not even going to entertain resentencing.
Again, this, unless I'm mistaken, because I haven't read the whole report, they didn't give a reason as to why they haven't entertained resentencing, or am I wrong about that?
Well, it's all to do with risk and the danger to, but I don't know. It's frustrating because something has to be done. You can't just keep all those people in prison when they don't know when they're going to be released or if they're going to be released. You can't do that.
So if that's the case, then surely you can assess the risk individually of each prisoner before asking when they're let out. So that just seems a simple thing to do.
But have they got the manpower? Have they got the money for it? Have they got the staff that will? Well, resentencing will be would be a lengthy thing to do, and it would involve a lot of people. But it's whether they're going to put resources into that, whether they want to do that, and it doesn't seem likely at the moment. I mean, I received a letter from an IPP. Um, when was it? Uh, I think it was the beginning of the year. It was called Joe Outlaw, and he was one that climbed onto the roof of prison um, to try and make a statement about IPPs, just to make people more aware, get it in the media. And when you read his story, it's yes, he had a lot of convictions, but the way that it's the IPP sentence was like destroying him and destroying others. uh, It was terrible. You see, we look at what people have done. We don't seem to look at why they've done it, what circumstances led them to crime. And I think if more resources were put into families, young people, even early years, if more resources were put in that, well, I'm sure our prisons would not be as full as they are today. You got to, you need to prevent people from getting, going down that road to prison. Give them something to hope for. Give them something in life, something to aspire to, and put the resources into that, not put the resources into building more prisons.
how, with regards to prisons, how has staff retention changed over the years, or has it changed?
Oh, it
Especially,
has,
okay.
yeah, it has changed. I mean, I remember when I first started really looking into prisons and having an interest in it. Um, I think what was his name? Grayling, Chris Grayling, that's right. He decided to look at he felt that the population was decreasing, so he didn't need as much staff. And so he offered incentives for a lot of the ones with many years experience, early retirement or whatever, and a very good package. And when I started working, monitoring, I remember talking to a few members of staff, and they said that the package that was offered to them was so good. Why should they stay on? So you lost a lot of experience. I think it was the Howard League that was it Howard Lee that said how many years of experience that was lost. It was just eye-watering. And what was replaced was with those with very little life experience. Maybe there was a scheme called Unlock Grads, where they took some of the top graduates and trained them as prison officers for 2 years. And they got a master's degree as well during that 2 years. They didn't have to stay on after that. They could go and work elsewhere. It was just a 2-year course. Some stayed. But the feedback that I got from people was quite interesting. One person I know in a prison, she worked in education, and she said that there was this group of young people, and she thought it was like a sixth form. They're on a day out. It was these unlocked grads that were trained to be prison officers. And I spoke to a few when they were just starting their training, and when I said about what was happening to some prisons, they were going, "No, that's just the media." I said, "What about the crisis in prison?" "No, no, 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 no." And it's like, well, they didn't know what they were getting involved in. I mean, some have done really well in that, but others, when you read inspection reports, when you read IMB reports, one of the things that you find in so many, and far too many, is the problems with the lack of experience of officers. It comes up time and time again, lack of experience. But that you lost all that experience. You lost the mentors, the ones that they call it jailcraft. That seems to have disappeared. And some that are left aren't necessarily the ones that you'd want to run a prison. I mean, I did some I delivered some training in one prison a few years ago, and I met some of the custodial managers there, and I thought, well, no wonder this prison is in the state that it is. When you've got people like that that've been working for years there, some of them were just, well, I don't know how to describe them, but awful. And I remember listening to some governors as well, the way they talked about those that actually in their care, the prisoners in their care, the way they talked about them. You think, why are you in this job? It's, but they are training more prison officers, but there's still a severe lack of them. And
What's the average
if they're building more prisons, where are they going to get the staff from for that?
Well, yeah, indeed, and it kind of leads on to my next question, which is, what's the average age of people starting as a prison guard, and has that changed? And also, how many years do people people prison guards before they actually decide to leave the profession? I imagine that's decreased as well.
Well, I think for some of them, um, you find that they don't even last a year. I don't think they understand the job that they're going to be involved in, and it's not an easy job. It's a hard job. I mean, I wouldn't want to do it. No way. I wouldn't want to be a prison officer. You know, I enjoy working in prisons. I enjoy going in prisons and talking with various people. I really enjoy that. That kind of environment I like working in, but I couldn't be a prison officer. No. Because I think you feel so helpless because your hands are tied all the time. There's so there's so little that you can actually do to help the majority of prisoners, you know, and I'd want to do more. But if there isn't the resources there, that'll be frustrating. I mean, I'm not naive. I'm not naive. I've seen, you know, and I've talked to staff where some of the prisoners there are very difficult to deal with, you know, very difficult. You know, I'm not saying all of them can be, their lives can change around and then they can leave prison and everything's hunky dory. No, I remember going into Holloway prison. I was invited by one of the governors there to go and have a look around and to talk to people and whatever. There was a dedicated group. I remember I went into one room, it was an office with loads of desks, loads of different people, and it was all different organisations that were there to help some of the women, you know, to do their best. But the stories that I heard, you know, and you know, some of the people that they had to deal with, I couldn't. I said to myself, I don't think I could ever work in a women's prison. It affected me so much. I don't know whether it's because I'm a woman myself, and you know, I don't know, but I thought it's not easy. It's not easy, not at all. And I admire those that can stick it out and actually make a difference in people's lives. But I don't know what percentage of prison officers are actually able to do that or willing. I don't know.
What's the starter pay for prison guards now?
Why don't they talk about it? You know, you can stack shelves at Tesco's for the same amount of money. Um, this I don't think it's a lot. I mean, we could look it up. I mean, some of those statistics would be quite interesting to know. I mean, if you get on a graduate scheme, you know, you do get more. Um, but, you know, you have to be a certain type of person to be able to commit yourself to working in that kind of environment.
That just seems for so little pay, and not only, it's not like you do one shift in the day and that's it. You probably have to work during the night and all these other times. It's yeah, it must be a thankless task in many ways.
And you don't know what you'll face. You don't know what you'll have to deal with, you know. And it's whether you're trained enough to cope with what you have to deal with. You know, you need to the training is too basic.
Yeah.
You know, it's not months and months of training. It's more like weeks of training. And to then go into a role like that, it's not enough. It's not enough. I mean, we do compare our prisons to the ones in Scandinavia, like Norway and that. Um, and it's like was it Bastoy and Holden Prison? You know, they're like examples of how a prison can be more humane. You treat people as individuals. You give them a better way of living while they're in prison, and that we often compare that. But there was a prison in this country called Blantyre House, and those in Scandinavia, or for Bastoy Prison, they came over to see how Blantyre House worked, and they took back to Norway some of the ideas, and the prison was based on some of the principles that they learnt here. But the Ministry of Justice shut it down. Shut down Blantyre. So that was a prison that sort of, well, I suppose excelled. There was trust between the prisoners and the staff. And so the Minister of Justice decided to raid it. There was a governor from another prison that headed that up and raided the prison, and they didn't really find much. And so when we've got things that work well, we don't even look after them. We don't use that as an example. It's like we just try and get rid of them. It's nonsense. I mean, you can read all about that. The governor of that prison of Blantyre House, he's written a book. Ian McLennan Murray, and it's fascinating to read about what they actually did. Crazy.
Why shut it down? It just seems if you've got a model prison, why not replicate it? Why?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's nonsense, isn't it?
Yeah, it's bizarre. I don't understand why you would do that. And you mentioned Scandinavia there. How does the prison system in this country compare to not just Scandinavia but other countries in Europe? Are there some things which you do better than others? Are there some things you do worse? Like, how does it compare in general?
Well, I think it's difficult to compare prisons because you've got, the different categories of prison in this country, and also you've got Victorian prisons. You've got ones that built in like the 60s, and you've got the newer prisons that maybe are built in the last 10 years. So it's very difficult to compare prisons. But when you think that if you look at the reoffending rate, um, 80%. No, wait, I wrote this down because I thought that was really interesting. 80% of offending is reoffending. 80%. That's what Lord Timpson said. 80% of offending is reoffending. So when people say prison works, what do they mean by works? Does it stop offending? No. What does it do? Well, in my eyes, it just warehouses people.
So, how do you measure how it works? Is it the reoffending rate going down? Is it what they do afterwards? Like, what measurements do governments use to see that any prison
Well,
system
but they
working?
don't. They just you use that prison works. Prison works. What? Well, it's take dangerous people off the out of society. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because you're removing that. But works. What do we mean by what do we want the prisons to do? And I think a lot of people are a bit confused of what we want prisons for. What they should actually do, and what should happen after people come out of prison. Um, it's a big question, isn't it? A lot of people would have a different answer.
It is
Prison work.
indeed. It is indeed. There seems to be a lack of will almost to improve the prison system. Um, it seems like in this country, because I always felt in like the UK, we seem to be what we call a headline culture, where a newspaper will say a headline and we almost gravitate towards it and we're guided almost by that headline instead of coming up with radical things. And it seems like that's the way with prisons at the moment, because whatever people think of them, just from the government having to release prisoners because they're nearly close to capacity, something needs to be done about it. And you hope there'll be more urgency, but it doesn't seem there is really.
Well, I think that there needs to be more transparency so that people are more aware of what actually happens within a prison. I mean, it was an eye-opener for me when I started with the Independent Monitoring Board. I'd visited a prison before, but I was just for particular events. But to find out the everyday you know, a prisoner, a prison officer, a governor. That was an eye opener. That was just, you know, I couldn't believe it. Um, but we'll soon have the headlines, won't we? We're coming up to Christmas, so we'll soon have the headlines. Um, uh, you know, prisoners, they won't call it, they won't call them that, they'll call them all sorts, won't they? And their Christmas lunches, look what they have, and look about, and what about there's the homeless, you know, ones on, you know, very little, they can't afford this, that, and the other, yet you're giving prisoners all this lovely food. Well, one of the things that I had to do was to taste the food. Every time I went in and I was on a rota to monitor, I had to taste the food. I've seen some Christmas lunches. I wouldn't say they were absolutely wonderful because a lot of food is processed. It comes in lorries every week. I've seen the lorries. There's not a lot of fresh fruit and vegetables. Some prisons do very well. They're able to grow produce, and that's great. That's fantastic. But a lot don't. So that's you know, they're the headlines that are going to come up. And some people that write about prisons have never stepped foot in one. So it's a bit like Chinese whispers, isn't it? You say one thing, it gets passed on, and then suddenly you get this headline about thing, and then everyone seems to believe it. See, I don't like to just read about things. I like to see for myself.
Mhm.
And you know, I find it a privilege to actually go into a prison to have that. And in a couple of weeks, I'm going spending a couple of hours with the governor at a prison, and I'm really looking forward to it. And I feel it's a privilege because you're stepping into it's almost like another world. But all these headlines. I went to an event a couple of years ago. It was around about this time of the year, and there was lots of barristers and solicitors and yeah, a lot of legal people and those within the justice sector, as you could call it. And we were talking about conditions of prisons and that, and there was someone who was a judge,
Mhm.
and they said, "I've never actually stepped foot in a prison. Yeah, I sentence people. I've never been in a prison." I thought, what? Magistrates in their training, part of their training, they don't necessarily. It's not part of their training to go in a prison. Strange, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it is strange in many ways. I just wonder if that's the case because you could affect, if you see the conditions that you could affect if a person's found guilty, what sentencing they get. So, for example, if you see a prison that the conditions are really harsh, this is in my view. I'm just thinking
Right.
out loud. If it comes out really harsh, well, think, oh, well, I've seen prisons. I don't think it'd be good that person spends X amount of time in there. So maybe I don't know. Maybe that might be a reason why they don't want to be stuffed on. There's more likely of a judge being stuffed on the sentences if they realise the actual conditions of the prisons. That's just one theory I'm coming up with. It's not something I agree with, but it's just the first thing that pops into my head.
Well, I think some are not aware of um what custodials, you know, what sentence you could have outside of going into prison. You know, prison isn't the answer to a lot of things. You know, what's wrong with community sentences? But a friend of mine was a magistrate, and she was very switched on. She knew what was happening in the area. She knew what community sentences were available and what was appropriate. But she's the only magistrate that I can honestly say that I felt that she knew what she was talking about, and she was all for um, not sending people to prison if it wasn't necessary. Um, but you know, most people, you know, a lot of people are sent to prison when prison is not appropriate, and they come out worse than they went in, there more things to deal with afterwards. You know, as I said earlier, you know, no housing, the job, loss of job, you know, families divided. Well, it doesn't always have to be that way.
Indeed. Just quickly then, because we're coming towards the end, just some quick bullet points. What would ideally you would like this government to do regarding the prison system? I know we are idealistic in terms of what we'd like, but realistically, what do you think the government could do with regards to this improving the prison system in this country?
And that's a biggie, isn't it?
Mhm.
Well, I'd like to see more transparency. I'd like to see more accountability. Um, I don't want money poured into building prisons that are not actually going to help those on release, you know, to stop reoffending. If it's not going to stop reoffending, well, there's a problem there. You know, then, you know, prisons don't work. If that's how you see it. Oh, Lord Timpson said that it's fixable. You know, whether I understand what he means by fixable or not, but he says it would take time. The problem is in this country, in the government, they the those that are responsible for prisons and probation and whatever don't stay very long, and they don't seem to. They have all these ideas, but they don't actually carry them through. We need someone who's going to stay there and will work at improving the system. Not just, we're not talking about 6 months, we're not talking about a year. It'll take, it's a long term fix, if you like to call it that way. So they're looking at a 10-year strategy. Well, I don't know whether Lord Simpson will be in that place for 10 years, but rather than just putting a sticking plaster on things, to actually really deal with things properly. It's a tough one. I think governors need to be more accountable. It's a tricky one here. And it's like if prison governors carried personal accountability for the way that they ran the prisons that they're responsible for, then things might change. Yeah, we might see change in HMPPS if that was it. But I think that the two key things is transparency and accountability. It should underline every decision. Too many things are swept under the carpet. No more excuses. No more excuses for the crisis. Oh, it was this because of this, because of that. Oh, it was the previous government. It was this. You know, deal with the now. But don't just have. There's too many. In my opinion, I'm just saying in my opinion, you know, I'm sure people would disagree with me. Too many roundtable events. I'm sure you've been to many yourself. Conferences, discussions, where everyone's saying virtually the same thing. So-called experts, yeah, but yet everything stays the same. We've got a crisis. You know, people didn't like it when I used to say there's a crisis in our prisons. Reform is taking too long. Oh, you're so negative, Faith. You're so negative. No, I'm just being, you know, that's what it is. It's in crisis. I'm saying it as it is. And people don't like that. Because I don't necessarily agree with what everyone else says. We write reports, reviews, paperwork that gets filed away and just collects dust. We've got to invest in people. We need to priorities need to change, and we need to just get on with things. and stop competing. Instead, work towards a common objective. I mean, for organisations as well, outside of, that work within the justice sector, they compete all the time because there's so little money that's available for funding. They're competing instead of, why can't they work together? And as I say, you've got to put money into early years, into youth. You've got to stop people from coming. You've got to prevent people coming into prison. Not just keep filling them up, not just keep building them and filling them. And while people are in prison, give them something proper to do. I mean, I've seen workshops where they take CDs and DVDs apart, put the plastic case here, the paper here, there's the actual disc there, and they're doing that for hours on end. How is that purposeful activity, and how does that aid it on release? How does that help in any way? And we need to scrap this large building programme. We need to invest in smaller local units so that families can be more involved. It's more accessible to families. And start to break down the barriers between those in prison and those on the outside. Take away the stigma.
Yeah, indeed. If people want to follow your work, where can they go to?
thecriminaljusticeblog.com.
Okay, cool. I'll leave a link to that blog in the description here. It goes up on YouTube, Spotify. Faith, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you for coming onto the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you. I've enjoyed it.